So far, about 20 Democrats have publicly called on President Biden to withdraw from the presidential race. A couple will say he should resign the presidency. Well, the folks at Black Voters Matter released their own statement calling such a decision reckless and short-sighted to change the nominee this late in the process. Joining us right now is a co-founder of Black Voters Matter, Cliff Albright. And Cliff, every time I saw one of these people put this thing out, I would go, okay, who's your pick? Then I would go, okay, if it's not Harris, how are you going to get around the money issue? How are you going to get around the fact that you can't transfer 1,000 staffers in 100 field offices? How are you going to get around trying to build a national campaign on the fly? None of these people could answer any of those questions. That's why this was stupid.
Yeah, and I think that what you're raising, the question that you raised in terms of like who else would you be picking, I think really shows the problem. There's a meme going around on social media talking about, the real problem with Biden's age is really Kamala Harris's race and gender. And that's really what's driving a lot of this, is that you've got some elected officials, some donors, definitely the media, it's not enough of an answer for you to say, well, if something were to happen to Joe Biden, heaven forbid, but if something did, obviously you got a vice president that's gonna fill in. That's what it is that they don't want to see happen. And that's why you see, or that's part of the reason why you see, these calls for him to drop out. Yes, we know that the debate was terrible. Yes, we know that he was old. As Professor Malveaux says, black folk knew that 4 years ago. Like, nobody black watched that debate and came out of the debate, wringing hands and gnashing teeth, say, oh my God, I didn't know Joe Biden was old. We knew that already. That was already baked in. But what we recognized 4 years ago, just as what we recognize now, is this is the best chance of beating Trump, and part of that is because of our distrust of the way that other white folks might vote. But what you're raising is really, it's a big part of the issue, which is that there's no process for how they would go about doing this. And we've argued that any process that would pass over the vice president would be detrimental to the base. You'll immediately lose a whole bunch of black women and black men that will see that level of disrespect. We, in our statement, what we said is that we want to see the process be respected. It's not coincidental in our minds that you have this call for the first time in decades. You have this call to ignore the primary results in the very first year when that primary was led by a southern state with a large number of black voters. So the primary system was changed in order to put South Carolina first, and then you put the year when South Carolina and black voters were put first to say, oh, we want to just ignore that there was a primary process. And that 14 million folks, a large number of which are black, voted for President Biden. So as you've said several times, it doesn't make, especially, I don't know about you, Roland, but anytime I see the level of coordination and collusion, like what we saw over those 2 or 3 weeks of the elected officials, the media, the billionaires and celebrities, all of the moneyed interests coming after Joe Biden, real and arguably, coming after him in a way, back in the day where they would say, you an N-word lover, right? I think part of the anger that he's been getting has been because of having a first black woman vice president, because of putting a first black woman on the Supreme Court, because of putting a historic number of judges within the judicial system. And we got another reminder today in the form of Judge Cannon about why it's important that you're able to put these judges in these positions. And so, when you see that level of collusion coming from the media and ignoring the polling, which I'm not a big fan of polling, like the same people that are talking about these polls now are the same polls that were telling us that there was a red wave coming in 2022, and we see where that wound up. So I'm not a big fan, except for a couple of people that I trust. But when you look at the polling that's come out over the past couple of days, with Biden either maintaining where he was, or in some cases, like with the Marist NPR poll, where he's developed a 2-point lead, and there's some other polls showing that he's developed the lead. When you see that happen after 2 weeks of just being pummeled by, his own party and by the media, when you see that, you got to wonder, what would the polls look like if for 2 or 3 weeks, instead of focusing on Biden and the debate, they were instead focusing on Project 2025, if they were focusing on Trump and the Epstein files, if they were focusing on these court cases. then what would the polling look like? But instead, we saw the opposite take place. So it's really amazing that he's still at where he's at in those polls.
Example here. Nancy, this Politico reported, I'll go to my iPad, Nancy Pelosi thinks Biden will lose, and she was working the phones to replace him. I was told point blank that Nancy Pelosi was not in support of Vice President Kamala Harris replacing Biden. So then you got to ask, well, who the hell were you going to get? And again, it's history shows you the 2 times Democrats replaced their nominee, they lost.
Right. Yeah, I mean, when you look at the Democrats in contested conventions, 1968, of all places, Chicago. When you look at the 1980 race and, Kennedy challenging Carter and what took place there. And then even as recently as 2016, which was somewhat of a contested debate, contested convention, those don't end well. They just don't end well. And this year, I think especially would be chaotic, and I really think would create a process where you'd see a lot of Black voters feeling like our voices were just ignored in favor of, again, the big money donors and celebrities, and in terms of the media, the corporate media interest. And so I don't see that process ending well. And I've got to add on that, look, there are people within our movement, people very close to me, heck, me, myself, who have legit concerns on policy matters in regards to President Biden, and one policy matter in particular in terms of Gaza. There's a debate that can be had there, right? Like people that favor human rights and all of that. We can have that debate and work out and discuss what would be better, on that issue. What would be better for Palestinians? Would it be Joe Biden, or would it be Trump, who we all know wants to expel Muslims and expel protesters and give Netanyahu a blank check to do whatever the heck he wants to do in Israel? But that can be a discussion. That's different from this discussion that we've seen in the media over the past 2 weeks, which has been focused on just his age, on just the debate, on just the polling. Oh, Lord. I hope I'm still there. But
yeah, you're here. You're here.
That's a different kind of debate. So it's fair game to talk about like real policies. What do we want more? What is the agenda? What was done well? What wasn't done well? Like all that's fair game, right? But this thing that we've been seeing play out in the media, that's been something that we all should be very concerned about, because again, a lot of it is driven by, again, not just President Biden's age, but the nature of VP Harris as the vice president.
Cliff, y'all are out there. You're going door to door. We had Adrienne Shropshire of Black Pac, and she talked about what they are hearing from folks door to door. And what she said is, and it looks, y'all are a nonpartisan organization, but the reality is, she said that they are seeing, as days progress, Black voters are going, hey, I'm not jumping up and down about Biden, but I do know there's a binary choice. And folks are making that choice. And I just simply believe one of the reasons you see these polling numbers the way they are is because, one, they're underpolling Black people, but also you're seeing that Black number go up as you go week by week. So it's sort of ludicrous to make an assessment saying, oh, they're guaranteed to lose based on what you see in July as opposed to what it's going to look like in October.
No, and that's actually the same thing that I've been saying, that our organization's been saying, to the media ever since January, or even going back to 23, where people were talking to us about the polling and what are Black folks going to do and why is enthusiasm slow and all of that. And we've been saying for the past year now, wait a minute, right? You can't judge anything a year out from the election. As we get closer, as there's more discussions, as people become more and more clear that this is a binary choice for the most part, right? Because I think for a lot of the year, I think there were some of us that still weren't quite believing that the twice impeached, felony convictions, for trial, all of that stuff, rapists, some of us weren't really believing that this dude is going to come back and be the nominee. But as we get closer, and again, we've been saying this for a year, that as we get closer to the election, as the reality sets in that this is not a referendum on Biden, that this is a choice between two candidates, as it, as the issues start getting more attention and more discussion, you got people now paying attention to the nature of the economy and what Black unemployment has been, and it's not as low as what we want it to be ever, right? It's always twice of whatever white unemployment is, but the reality is that under this administration, we've had the lowest unemployment ever in history, so that as we get closer to the election and we start getting more information about the reality of the economy, the realities around, around what this administration, particularly the Department of Justice, has done on police accountability and holding some of these police departments accountable, that the more and more that some of the good story gets out there, and again, it's not a perfect story, but there's a story there to be told. And we've been saying that the more and more that we have these conversations, the more and more that Black media gets resources to put information out there, the more and more that groups like ours and all the others in this ecosystem are able to knock on those doors and make those phone calls and send those text messages, the more that our folks get good information from legit conversations, that the more that you would start to see those polling numbers change. And that's exactly what it is that we've been seeing. This ain't rocket science, y'all. But when you got a bunch of people out there that at the end of the day, and I've said this repeatedly for years, that you've got some Democrats, traditional moderates, whatever you want to call them, establishment, who would rather lose elections than to give way to a progressive Black and brown base, to give way to progressive policies, right? To give way to a president that would pick a Black woman to be his vice president, that there are some Democrats that would rather lose elections. And some of these quotes that we're now seeing coming out in the media are basically saying that, where they're saying, you know what, we're just resolved that we're just going to have another Trump presidency. The only way that you're resolved with that is if you really don't mind that happening. And you've got some people within the establishment that's that position, that they're okay with that happening, because at the end of the day, they don't have as much to lose as what our communities have. George Clooney and them, they don't have as much to lose as what our communities have stake. This isn't a game for us, right? These are our lives. When you look at Project 2025, it's the most marginalized communities, Black folks, brown folks, indigenous folks, women that are going to be feeling the brunt of 2025. You got this dude that he just announced for his vice president, who is out there talking about women should stay in even abusive, violent marriages, right? Because they want to get rid of no fault. Not only do they want to get rid of no fault divorce, they don't even want you to be able to get a divorce, even if you're getting abused. This is not a game, right? And there are some people whose lives are going to be more greatly impacted than others. And those are the folks that, to a large extent, in our communities and our conversations, that are saying stay the course, whereas some of the other folks that got that luxury, that have that privilege, they want to play games around having some lottery system to pick the nominee.
Last question I have for you before I go to my panel with questions. I believe this 100%. I want to get your take. Do you believe that Project 2025 is going to play a crucial role in driving Black, Latino, and young turnout?
Yes. I think the more that we have these conversations, the more that people learn. And shout out to Taraji P. Henson, who did more in 30 seconds at the BET Awards to raise the profile of Project 2025 than most media had done. And shout out to Simone Sanders, who on her show, she had the dude at the Heritage Foundation, who came on, and, some people were critical because we say, well, why do you give them a microphone, right? And sometimes you give them the microphone so that they can expose themselves. And so Simone Sanders on her show was able to do that. That's where the president of Heritage, which for those who don't know, Heritage Foundation is the group that's behind Project 2025. Also, a group which was founded, as they speak about heritage, they were founded and in the early years put a lot of attention, and still to this day, to reinforcing school segregation and trying to fight against integration. That's the same Heritage Foundation that's behind this Project 2025. But I think that the more that people learn about it and talk about all the different ways that they're trying to take over government and get rid of voting rights and send women back and we're going to be doing a series of one-pagers talking about the things that are specifically targeted against Black folks. Things like continuing the attacks on affirmative action and DEI. In fact, they want to take the Department of Justice and Office of Civil Rights, and instead of it being to enforce, the Civil Rights Act, they want to twist it around to say that civil rights moving forward is going to be investigations of anti-white discrimination. That's what this Department of Justice would become. And so any advances that we've made in terms of civil rights and having the Department of Justice enforce that and implement that would literally be turned around, where they would now be criminalizing and investigating any efforts to deal with racial justice. That's part of what's at stake. Environmental protections. They want to get rid of the whole office whose sole job is to deal with environmental racism, right? Think about Flint. Think about Jackson's water. Think about environmental catastrophes and the impacts of climate change and flooding in our communities. They want to get rid of that office, right? They want to get rid of anything that tracks racial conditions, right? Because you can't make a claim that Black folks are facing inequities if you're not even tracking the inequities. They want to get rid of all of that. So there's several pieces of this 900-page document that specifically target Black folks. And the more and more that we have those conversations, then we believe the more and more that to your point, Roland, that Project 2025 trumps Project 2025, because we got to make it clear. This is Trump's, and Professor Malveaux was just talking about this. This is Trump's Project 2025. These are his people. These are his former administration, his former advisors, and not just former, but these are people that he is saying that he's going to be bringing back if he were able to get back in. So this is Trump's Project 2025, and we got to remind people of that every opportunity that we get, because it's not a game. And I argue that this part of what this so-called shooting, and that's a whole nother discussion, but part of this, and Black Twitter is going to get to the bottom of it, trust me, but part of what's behind this so-called shooting is that it has changed the conversation, where increasingly people are talking about Project 2025 online. Even some of the media was being pushed into it. And just like that, the narrative has been changed, so that now all they're talking about is the so-called shooting that took place. And so we have to stay focused. We can't wind up chasing all these other things. We've got to stay focused on talking about Trump's Project 2025, talking about what's at risk, and keeping our eyes on the prize.
Lauren, your question.
Cliff, good seeing you.
Hey.
We just had a primary, as you know, a primary on June 18 in Virginia, and in talking to people who've been knocking doors, they say the issue that keeps coming up at the doors is the economy, the economy, the economy. I wanted to hear from you. Do you think abortion is a big issue for Black voters in the same way it is for white voters? Or is it just the issue that the Democrats want to talk about because they're getting millions and millions of dollars from Planned Parenthood? What do you think about that? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually think that it is a big issue in our communities, and for a couple of reasons. And you could look at Ohio and look at the turnout that you saw in Ohio when they had that referendum on abortion rights. Black folks came out in large numbers. I even saw a poll that said that Black men actually voted for the referendum even at an even higher rate than Black women. I'm kind of skeptical of that, but there's some evidence that that it's not even just a Black woman's issue, that Black men, and I think some of the conversations that I've had lots of conversations with brothers that were like, yeah, we got to do something about this. And so I do think that it's a big issue. And part of the reason it's a big issue in our community is because it's a combination of several things, right? It's a combination of the health, it's a combination of the choice issue, like in and of itself, right? It's also a healthcare issue. We know the impact of reproductive justice in terms of like maternal mortality, right? And so for us, it's a health issue. It's also an economic issue. It's not separate from those economic issues that people are very much concerned about. Whether or not you have a child is in part an economic issue. There are certainly economic implications to it. And so for us, and it's a criminal justice issue, because Lord knows that if they start criminalizing, having abortions or trying to travel across lines to do so, who's going to get profiled the most when they're on the highways traveling to do that? And so for us, it's a combination of issues. It's not a standalone issue in and of itself, and that's what we hear a lot when we talk about that issue. But they view it as a wedge issue, because you still do have some segments of our community, the deeply religious community that for them that can be a wedge issue. But I think to a large extent, I'm not saying it's more important than the economic, because again, I think that there's connections between them. But I do think that it's a legit issue that folks in our community are talking about.
I will say this here: when they had the Ohio referendum, black men voted in significant numbers for that referendum in Ohio. Julian.
First of all, thank you all for the work you do at Black Voters Matter. It's such an important organization, and it's really, really, really important. But everybody's talking about polling. Roland mentioned undersampling, the way that African Americans are undersampled. The other statistical issue is not only the undersampling, but the size of the samples. So we're talking about a poll that has 1,200 people in it and maybe 100 Black people. Well, margin of error there is all over the place. Why aren't people talking more about some of these statistical errors as they talk about the flaws in these polls?
Yeah, somebody famous once said, "Figures don't lie, but liars do figure." Right? I've taken enough stats classes in my life to know that you can create a sample and sample size and all that to say just about whatever you want to say. But you're exactly right. That New York Times Siena poll that a couple of months ago made a big splash. It was one of the biggest ones that was talking about Black voters, and I think it was like the 5 or 6 swing states that they were looking at and saying it was like 20%. But if you got into the details of that poll had about 400 and something Black folks, right? But again, this was across 6 or 7 different swing states. And so essentially what you were looking at was a national story that was really based on like 60 or 70 Black folks in each one of those states. And so you're right. The sample sizes in some of these, especially when you're talking about Black folks. But I think to answer your question, a lot of people don't dig into that level of detail. A lot of people don't dig into the methodology of these polls. They don't dig into the sample sizes. They don't dig into, the crosstabs and the different relationships between age and race and all of that. And so we're just left with what? We're left with the headlines that whatever media, mainstream media, decides to focus on when they're reporting on that. That's why it's important for us to be able to do our own polling, and shout out to, Cornell Belcher and Adrian and work that Black Pac's been doing on doing a series of polls and focus groups, because they really were some of the first to be able to point out that, that there's a whole segment of our community that is thinking differently than what you would have the mainstream media would have us believe. And so we've got to be able to study these polls a lot more closely and to be able to do our own polling.
Thank you so much for all of your work, and it's so appreciated and needed. There have been so many things that have been in the news, from abortion to the assassination attempt to all of these different conversations that are necessary to have. But I feel like one thing that has slipped off the radar is conversations about voter suppression. Can you give us your latest information and news you have about voter suppression efforts that you're seeing going on across the country?
Yeah, I'm so glad you raised that, because it's been one of my biggest frustrations. And I say it to every journalist that tries to talk to us about these polls and about Black enthusiasm. And I make this point: Black turnout is not just a function of Black enthusiasm. Right? Black turnout is not just a function of Black enthusiasm. It's also a function of to what extent we have the right and we have the access and the ability to cast our vote. Right? When we weren't voting in the South, throughout Jim Crow, it wasn't because we weren't enthusiastic. Right? If enthusiasm was the only thing that mattered, that we would have been voting in big numbers, throughout the entire 20th century, but we weren't. And why? Because we were in the midst of Jim Crow, and there wasn't the legal framework that would let us act on our enthusiasm, act on our hopes and dreams for how we could control our lives. So Black voting has never just been a function of how motivated or how enthusiastic we is. It's also always a function of voter suppression. And that's exactly what we're seeing, and what we're very concerned about going into this election cycle. We know that the Republican Party has a strategy of recruiting thousands, I think like 10,000 of these poll watchers that they want to recruit. So, and in some of these states, those poll watchers have the ability, not just theoretically, like we've seen this happen in states so far. We saw it happen in North Carolina, where they go into these polling places and they are intrusive, right? They get in the way of the poll workers, the poll clerks being able to do their jobs. They get in the way sometimes of voters being able to vote, and they wind up intimidating voters. And so, excuse me, I think I got whatever Roland got. And so what we've seen happening is that voter suppression continues to be a major problem, and especially in some of these battleground states, in Georgia, in North Carolina, even in states that should be more of a battleground, but part of the reason that they're not is because of the voter suppression. Florida should be a lot more competitive than it is. People look at, why did the last Florida election go the way that it went, and they think it's just because Rick DeSantis was possible. No, it's also because Florida passed one of the worst voter suppression laws in the country. And so to answer your question, some of the things that we're seeing are, attacks on every phase of the process. They've made it more difficult to vote by mail. They've attacked drop boxes. They're still reducing the number of polling places. Of course, we know what they do with the photo ID, both for in-person as well as when absentee voting. And the thing that we've been saying for years, and we have got to keep an eye on this, y'all. The thing that we've been saying for years now, one of the most insidious pieces has been the way that they've, in some of these laws in some of these states, they've made it possible to take over local county boards of elections, to take over that process, to have board members be able to be replaced by the state legislatures, right? Or had the state legislatures. In some cases, they've taken away the power of the Secretary of State. I think Arizona might be an example of this, where they've taken away powers from the Secretary of State and put it more in the hands of the legislature. And so these different mechanisms that they're using, not just to suppress the vote, but also to control the count. That is something that we have got to keep a very close eye on throughout this election cycle.
Cliff, we appreciate it, man. Thank you so very much.
All right, thank you, Roland.
All right, then.